what we're doing as painters, we're orchestrating images. So we have to find ways when if we want an idea that has a solo image, the reason I called it solo there at the bottom, if we want to have a solo image, then we've got to find a way to balance that solo image with everything else that's going on in the painting, make it belong. When we painters are working with isolated shapes, they can either shoot us in the foot or they can become a powerful composing tool. Think about it like this. We painters are working with two-dimensional space. No matter what the images are, it's still that two-dimensional space. How we arrange our images, or whatever we put in that two-dimensional space, determines how the human eye will read them. Here our eyes are roaming over two major shapes, here and here. There's nothing specific within the shapes, only color and textures. But now we have a major interruption. An image totally different has appeared and caused the human eye to go straight to it. And no matter where we locate it in this space, it still claims all the attention. That is what isolation does when it shoots us in the foot. It causes the eye to go to it and ceases then to be interested in everything else that's going on. As painters, when we have isolated images, we find a way to make them work in that two-dimensional space, and that's what this study is all about. From my viewpoint, this painting of John Singer Sargent's is one of the most beautifully composed, almost perfectly composed paintings of all his body of works. You see this little boy, he's an isolated image, but Sargent has composed it in such a way that the isolated image belongs to the entire painting. Now here's one way he's done that. Notice how the woman is looking down at the little boy and how the basket she's holding out, creating a visual path towards the little boy. And then the little boy's looking down, and that too pulls our visual movement in that direction. Now watch what happens when I turn the woman's head in another direction and take away the basket. Now the little boy is isolated. Do you see the difference? It weakens that whole composition. He really feels isolated there. Now, it would work all right as a painting, and, as a less successful painting, but people might not notice it. But certainly the way Sargent originally constructed it unites that whole scene in such a way that we don't feel anything lacking. Another thing Sargent has done, and he has done beautifully throughout his major works, is the way he puts figures together. He groups them together in such a way that they are unified together and unified into the whole piece. Now look at that group of three women. I'm going to take away that central figure. Now you see how isolated those other figures look without that central figure there. In fact, now we have the boy feels more isolated, although he feels a little more unified with the woman who's looking towards him because of that directional pull. The woman in the center is isolated, and that group of the woman and the young boy on the left are feeling isolated. So Sargent has grouped these by making a group of three women there, and this woman plays that central role of unifying that entire group. So that's one method we can use when there are multiple images, whether it's people or trees on a hill, or trees isolated in fields such as we saw earlier, overlapping them, grouping them so that some are overlapped or maybe some are giving a directional pull towards others is one way of unifying them and unifying them into the whole painting. Now let's take a look at the woman and the young boy on the left. Notice here how the basket the woman is carrying is overlapping the boy behind her. Now I won't take that away, but that is it's a visual technique. Of course, he's put together there the action of what's actually going on in that scene with the visual composing. And he's unified those images that otherwise would be isolated, unified them by grouping and by overlapping. So those are two major ways that we can handle images we want to include in our work, which in our reference might be isolated. It's to find ways to overlap them or to group them within overlapping or group them within some sort of directional pull. This 19th century painting by Jerome is an excellent example of another way we can use directional movement to make an isolated image belong in a painting. So we have that central isolated image, which is obviously the area of emphasis. Now, that's the term I prefer over focal point. I know the term focal point is used by most painting teachers. I don't like it because of the word point. It suggests too narrow an area. So I'm going to call it area of emphasis. That's my term. Back to the subject, we can see that central figure, that isolated figure, is our area of interest, but belongs to the piece, does not stick out like a sore thumb, belongs to the piece for three different reasons. And those three different reasons are also techniques we can use to make isolated images belong to our paintings. One is also the use of directional pull with one-point perspective. We see it right here where he's used one-point perspective actually to pull our attention to that isolated image. But because of the way everything else is arranged, the attention, the visual path, is going from the isolated image up the stairs, back down, and so on. So the isolated image is actually a part of the painting due to our placing emphasis on it. And that brings us to another way we can make isolated images belong in our paintings. Simply make them a part of the visual path. So any kind of directional pull, whether it's one-point perspective or whether it's simply the way we've leaned those images or aligned those images toward the isolated image. That's what we mean by directional pull. So that's a major way that we painters can make isolated images belong rather than sticking out like sore thumbs. One way to remember it, if it sticks out like a sore thumb, it doesn't belong. Another way Jerome has made that figure belong is with using an analogous color scheme or having the image to fit so that the colors are within and around the image are analogous. Now let me illustrate to you what happens. You can see there that all these colors in this area right here, in fact, the color scheme itself is built on warm colors. This is an analogous color scheme with a slight emphasis of the complements we can see right here. But all these are in the warm color range, the warm hue range. Now what if Jerome had used here a blue garment instead of a brown garment? There you go. See how isolated that feels? If he had used that in his painting, not even doing that would cause it to fit into the rest of the painting, even though this hue is pretty much in the same hue range as this and this and this and this. Nevertheless, because it's that central figure, because it's an isolated figure, it sticks out like a sore thumb. That's the sort of thing we watch. We lean color or lean hue in such a way that it blends visually with the areas around it. So that's another technique we can use to make the isolated images belong. And a third way we can make isolated images belong, illustrated by Jerome here, is value range. Finding a way to keep the isolation, or most of it at least, in a similar value range. Let's bring the color reader over to do that. We'll just park it about right here. Now let's bring our little color value reader over, and we start reading. Now look right here. This is the value range. So I'm going to read areas within his cloak, and I find it's mostly in that dark value range right here. And now let's read the area around it. And there you are. The areas immediately around him is kept within that dark value range. As long as the values are within 3 value intervals of the values within the major values within the isolated image itself, it belongs. It has enough contrast to emphasize. In this, it does have enough value contrast to emphasize the image, but it belongs in that value range, and that helps the image feel as if it belongs to the whole painting. Andrew Wyeth is a master at composing with isolated shapes, and Christina's Whirl is a prime example of that mastery. And this brings us to the last, and you might say a very important way that we can compose with isolated shapes, and that is to allow the isolated shape to be the subject of the painting itself. But if he had just simply made her the subject, such as we see here, the painting would not be nearly so powerful. Maybe a bit mysterious, but not nearly so powerful. And even if he'd placed her in the same environment without the other isolated elements, we see it still feels empty, meaningless. Here's the environment that Wyeth chose to put Christina in. We see 2 major shapes, and this is often a wonderful way to compose that sort of message where you're making the isolated images, or the isolated, in some cases, a single isolated image, as the subject of the painting itself. It's what the painting is all about. So this is the environment, just 2 empty shapes. Now remember, we're dealing with 2-dimensional space when we're painting, and this is what Wyeth has set up here, a 2-dimensional space with 2 major shapes. He's placed Christina in that, but it still feels empty. Christina is isolated in this big space, but nothing up here to really bring our eye to where she's going. Now we add the house, we have more meaning, but we have only a single directional movement. So the eye only does this. But when we add the little building, we see the composition come together. Look what he's done here now. The little building serves as a visual anchor, you might say, to pull our eye back in this direction and bring our eye back down to Christina. And so now we have a triangular path. We can see it diagrammed right here. When we have a subject like this, where there are many parts of the subject that can encompass a large area, that subject itself can be or can encompass a larger part of the canvas of the painting. And when we do that kind of use of an isolated image, then the many parts of the image itself become other parts of the painting, and it is no longer isolated. Let's summarize all this now. We're talking about techniques, methods for working with isolated shapes to make them belong. We can do that by grouping, by overlapping, the way we saw Sargent doing it, and by directional pull, the way we saw Sargent doing it. We can do it by linking, by using the directional alignment that we saw both Sargent and Jerome doing, by using similar values that we saw in Jerome, analogous colors that we saw in Jerome, by making it a part of the visual path that we saw in Jerome and in Wyeth. And then in Wyeth, we saw, in addition, how we can make the isolated image the subject itself. And we can do that simply by using the image and related images to create a visual path.
Wyeth's images they're really singular, but because of how he's arranged them, they are relating to each other. And in that relationship, they relate not only to each other, but to the space space that they're occupying. And he makes it work. And, you know, a lot of his paintings, he uses that technique. A lot of them will be isolated images, but just look at how he made the isolated image work. There's one that of the boy running up the hill. I think it's a single image, and he makes that work. So he can make single images work. But if you look at what he's done to make them work, it will be a combination of these things I just outlined for you here.
Be sure and view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianeMize.com where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.